Welcome, my friend, to another episode of the Chasing Poker Greatness podcast. As always, this is your host, the founder of ChasingPokerGreatness.com, Coach Brad Wilson. And today is Friday. Well, it's a special Friday because it's Philosophical Friday. As some of you may have noticed last week, there was no episode because I was traveling and attending my Tactical Tuesday co-host John's wedding. So that was super fun. I'm sure we'll talk about it in next week's Tactical Tuesday. But for now, I'm back with Duncan. Duncan, how you doing, my friend?
Good. I missed you, man. Like, how can we miss podcasts? Like I really needed to do it last week. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. It's a thing that you never knew that you needed to do it every week, but now
Right.
you know you need to do it.
Absolutely. It's one of those things that you're gonna let it out. You wanna speak your mind on things.
Yeah, you get in the routine, and then all of a sudden, your co-host disappears into the ether for a week, and you're just left there. I'm sure that at our standard recording time of this podcast, you opened a Zoom and just stared into the camera like Pablo Escobar questioning the meaning of life and where's Brad? But we're resolved.
That's right. Yeah, I did above average writing this last week, which I think
Yeah,
is it probably has to do with the fact that we skipped the podcast. So
there you go. Yeah, you just used a different medium to express your creativity and your thoughts. And apparently some stuff happened while I was gone that I was completely unaware of. So let's dive into today's topic of conversation.
Right.
First and foremost.
Right. So a lot of things have happened. One of the things that grabbed my attention, mostly because I'm very interested in that specific topic, there was a little bit of a drama in Joy Ingram's podcast. So Ebony Kenny, she won a big tournament, and she went over there to have a discussion with Joy. And to make a long story short, the podcast ended up somewhat abruptly at the end. There was basically a disagreement on what I would consider a topic of censorship. I mean, it's probably best for people to go and listen to the podcast because at least the end of it if they want to make their own conclusions. But if I were to summarize it as fairly as I can, basically the disagreement was on how much Joey should essentially censor his viewers when they get out of line, and what out of line is. In particular, I think there was some misogynistic comments in YouTube chat, which is not surprising to anybody who knows how chat works. But I think that's basically the disagreement on whether or not. So the B word was uttered, and Ebony's point was that Joy should has responsibility. That people who are in his chat is his responsibility, and he has both not just responsibility, but also part of the blame, or the general issue that
Sure.
women today in poker have a trouble being able to find peace in poker rooms and things like that. So like I said, I mean, it expands more from there, and it's going to be difficult for me to do the disagreement justice. And Joey was trying again to defend himself to the best of his abilities, but then Ebony she abruptly left, so there was no conversation to be had of that.
Yeah. So the chat wasn't being censored enough or properly or at all. I don't know the answer if it's just at all is the answer.
I think that's actually an interesting question, because exactly what does that mean? Because there are some moderators, and the moderators, they're trying to do their best, but what does best mean? And like, where do we draw the line? I mean, these are some questions that I thought we can ask ourselves. So what I was thinking today is to talk a little bit about censorship, because I think that's the interesting part out of all of this, right? I mean, what is censorship? Is it necessary? Where do we draw the line? What are some heuristics that we can use? Are we even heading in the right direction? And
or heading in a direction.
In a
at all.
direction. That's a good point. And I actually did write something about it, like as I was thinking about it, that maybe, I can perhaps read some of that later.
Go ahead and read your letter, and then I think we can go from there, because I think this is like there's a lot of room for discussion, but for the most part, I see myself in the future rehashing a lot of things that I've said a bunch on this podcast specifically.
Absolutely. So let me just go here and a lot of it comes to essentially understanding the concept of free speech and how do we value it in society. But basically, I'm gonna read these thoughts because I think they're going to be a little bit more clarified than me just mumbling for a couple of minutes. Yeah. So I guess.
So stop mumbling and read.
Stop mumbling and read, right? So where do we draw the line is the first question I ask, right? A natural question to ask is how much free speech is necessary for a healthy community to operate functionally? And is there such a thing as, for example, too much free speech? Advocates of the affirmative would claim that if you allow a villain to say something seemingly innocuous, yet in their opinion toxic, who's going to stop the same villain from escalating the toxicity to the point that they're now engaged in really offensive and potentially harmful conversations, right? So who is there to stop them, right? And the issue with that approach is that this theoretical line can move in both directions, both of which are concerning if they move too deep, right? So true, in some cases, some ideas can be potentially dangerous and even detrimental to society when pursued. But by the same token, lack of expression can lead to oppression, lack of progress, indirect retaliation, and other undesirable effects that are equally, if not far more dangerous. The issue is, of course, that if we have trouble drawing the line in what is the worst thing we should allow, we should also have trouble drawing the line in what is the best thing we should censor. And let's also not forget that, historically speaking, those who think they know when to start censoring are those who don't know when to stop, right? Sometimes, like Hitler and Stalin are two infamous examples of such an approach, which started as an attempt for society's greater good in their minds anyway, and ended as totalitarian regimes responsible for the premature death of millions of innocent people. So that's one issue that we have. Where do we draw the line negatively but also positively? Personally, I find the freedom of expression so fundamentally important for our survival that I would argue that censorship is a threat to our own existence. In contrast, allowing bad ideas to exist is not as harmful as it may seem at first, as they will have to survive a vicious opposition before they start to spread. And even then, there's probably a good reason why they became contagious in the first place, one that is probably worth our time to investigating. Incidentally, by the way, I do think that humanity is anti-fragile, right? So some of its biggest breakthroughs, like the abolition of slavery, came from exposition itself to atrocious and hurtful mistakes, which it then realized it had to correct in order to progress. So freedom of speech magnifies that healthy animosity towards terrible ideas. In some sense, freedom of speech self-protects itself from the downsides by its own existence. So by having freedom of speech, we're protecting ourselves from bad ideas. I would also argue that freedom of speech is only secondary to human rights. So when the two are in conflict, it would make sense to censor the former in order to protect the latter, at least in theory. But in order for one to truly violate human rights, one typically needs to use more than words. And that's the crucial part. As a rule of thumb, words alone cannot hurt you unless you allow them to. Unless, of course, said words lead to some specific action, in which case they no longer deserve the name words alone, as they are now equivalent to an action. For example, a person should not have the right to order someone to kill you. More precisely, they can say whatever they want, even give the order, as long as what they say never translates into action. In other words, as long as the order is never carried out. This is, of course, easier said than done, like a very tough problem to solve, and our legal system is a testament of this, and finding a balance is a perpetual work in progress.
Yeah, like I immediately think of like just females in the workplace getting harassed,
right,
but never actually getting assaulted, right? Where their words are being said, but no action is happening. Mm-hmm. It is sort of the first thing that popped into my head as you were talking, because yeah, you can go ahead now.
Absolutely. No, this is, I do acknowledge this as an issue, right? I mean, it's easier said than done, right? And sure. And I think we have to discuss a little bit about that as it pertains to poker too. All that said, at the very least, we have some sense, and what you just described is that sense of what works and what doesn't after years of tweaking and trial and error. This is both embedded in our culture and our current laws. So it's not perfect, but we do have something which is better than what we had 1,000 years ago, let's say, and even like 50 years ago, like better than 50 years ago. And do you want to say something here? That's okay.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was gonna just. I don't want to disrupt your
No, please.
reading. Where are we at percentage wise of your writing?
Like almost like we have 2 more paragraphs and then we're done.
2 more paragraphs and done. All right, do your paragraphs and then we'll go through it.
Right. So because this is a serious point, what you just said, this is basically my next point. Like this leads to the next point. Although absolute censorship is detrimental and it should not exist, it is okay for individuals to express their disapproval in the form of opposing statements and even ignore or ostracize other individuals whose views they find fringe, as long as they're not physically violate any of their rights. Basically, what I'm saying is, like bad ideas, like the ones that you described, they should be opposed, like with free speech. Oppose bad ideas with free speech, essentially. This is the cost of expressing oneself. One should have the right to say whatever they want, but not the right to be accepted or even the right to not be ridiculed, right? Again, provided that none of their human rights are affected directly. This is a healthy reaction to potentially bad ideas and how we weed out the chaff from the wheat. It is, if this is uncomfortable to people, it is maybe not the society that needs to change, but us as individuals. Besides, it to be fundamentally much easier to grow thick skin and adopt to the world around us rather than trying to make it fit our own very unique idiosyncrasies. Allowing retaliatory or dismissive forms of free speech to combat potentially bad ideas is a form of what I would call pseudo-censorship that gives clear bounds to what a society can realistically tolerate implicitly and a posteriori without explicitly preventing someone from expressing themselves and thus denying us an a priori opportunity to be exposed to a potentially good idea. While all of this is happening, there are also some current rules in place, both written and unspoken, that our contemporary society has deemed appropriate to follow for our present situations. Meta-humility at the level of the individual dictates that these rules should be followed because they carry with them a certain wisdom of our predecessors, as well as all of their mistakes and failed tweaking that led to this point. At the same time, meta-humility at the level of the society dictates that these rules should also be questioned because they're imperfect and can be improved. So in some sense, these rules of conduct need to both be followed and be questioned at the same time. That said, there's an asymmetry of the weight between the society and the individual that hints to the fact that rules need to be followed far more than they need to be defied, because the chances one individual will know better than 1 trillion of ancestors before them are very slim and rather meta-arrogant unless they somehow have access to evidence which was unavailable to them.
All right. So I think there are a bunch of entry points there. I just want to start by saying that fundamentally, I believe that YouTube is not society. I think that, YouTube chat, people are more often than not anonymous with really no tangible downside to whatever they spew in the chat box. So like they can just do it and disappear and nobody ever knows. There's no like personal downside generally, which I think is probably the root of a lot of the behavior that goes on in YouTube specifically, because like, they're not called out publicly because they're under some sort of anonymous pseudonym. And so like starting from that perspective, my approach to podcasting, to interviewing people, which I have quite a bit of experience at this stage of my life, is that they're a guest. You invite a guest to your home, and then I don't want my guests to be mistreated. That's how I feel by my specific audience and my specific listeners. Now, there is another thing that came to mind too, as it relates to Joey's core audience. Who are they? Right? I believe that, your vibe attracts your tribe. And if there's a lot of immaturity on your channel, right? A lot of like things that appeal to like the 18 to 24-year-old male demographic, this is the behavior that you would expect, right? You wouldn't expect it from a more mature audience. And I think that's part of the problem, is that like there's some part of Joey's core audience that are just knuckleheads, to really I was going to say put it bluntly, but that's not really that blunt, a knucklehead.
Sure.
And yeah, I think, my personal opinion, yeah, like no guest should come on my podcast and get called names. I don't care, like male or female, whichever way, but especially female in the poker space. I feel, because in this space, like another thing I've thought of is like criticism, pushback. There's a lot of pushback, a lot of criticism for people of influence in this space. Just go follow Nick Howard on Twitter and see, a lot of the replies to every single one of his tweets on a daily basis. And what I think, how I think about that, is that whenever you're trying to do something great or big, you create a kind of gravity around you. Mm-hmm. And when you create that gravity, sometimes debris gets in it, just shit gets in your gravity and starts orbiting you, and you can't get rid of it, right? But like that's just the price that you pay to having gravity, right? And I think that in the poker space, whenever you're a female specifically with gravity, you get a lot more shit in your orbit. And it feels like it is a very tangible thing. I hate that we have to have this conversation, by the way. Mm-hmm. I would so much rather have a female on here to be a part of the conversation. But to me, it feels like, lots more debris gets in the females in this space. You just orbit them. And I think that whenever you're providing them a platform, it should be safe, and that kind of bullshit just shouldn't be tolerated. I mean, that's how I feel about the situation. And I think, like, if it were me and my listeners were like saying names in the chat, I would have cut the live feed, finished it privately, and then released it privately where it was a safer space.
Let me say a couple of things, because you're making some very good points here. So number one is, I'm not entirely sure. Again, I wasn't actually looking at the chat. I was listening to the conversation. And I'm not sure if the names were actually addressed directly to Ebony. I'm not sure about that. Or like, people were just using them. I think like they were talking to one another, I believe, and something like that. They weren't like addressed to her directly, perhaps, but I could be wrong on this. But the second thing that I wanted to also mention is, I was very careful to not, like mention at all in the things that I wrote, but also in my head. I didn't want this to be more like, a male-female kind of situation, right? It's because, again, I mean, like I said, we don't have a representative, like they can tell us, their own experience. I just wanted to talk purely personally, but we can expand. I mean, this feels Friday about censorship.
I think it's, as it relates to censorship, right? Yeah. Like, I think that it does matter the amount of material that needs to be censored as it relates to whoever's coming onto your platform.
Right.
I would imagine that if Jason Kuhn went on Joey's podcast, there would be a much lower need for censorship because of the space that we're in.
Right.
I mean, that's why I specifically made it like a male and female thing.
Okay.
Because this audience is 90% male, and there are a lot of people who make tons of derogatory comments towards females specifically. And because it's like 90% male, the amount of negative comments skyrockets.
Right. This is essentially the law of large numbers, right? I mean, if most of the misogynists are men, and you have 90% men and 10% women, obviously you're going to have more misogynists in your group than if you were like 50-50. That's sure. Just essentially the law of large numbers. But this would be like a good point to start. In your mind, what would you define as censorship? Let's start here. What is censorship for you in a podcast context, let's say?
So I think, it's a classic answer, right? Of it depends. I
think
so I haven't, since I don't do live YouTube interviews, or I've only done a few. I haven't really encountered this problem, but I think the first thing I would do would set protocols, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're having Ebony Kinney on, you have a giant audience,
Right.
have a conversation with her beforehand about how does the chat affect you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what would you like me to do here? People are probably going to say bad things because that's the expectation. How would you like me to deal with that in a way that makes you feel comfortable, right? And then just start there. Have like a 5-minute conversation about that, and then be like, okay, cool. Like, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Maybe she doesn't care, right? She's like, whatever, just they can go nuts. It doesn't bother me at all. Or maybe she cares a lot, in which case I think that measures need to be taken in order to provide her a safe space. And I mean, that's just because, again, she's the guest, right? She's a guest who's entering your home on your platform. So you need to take care of your guests.
And I like that approach. I like that approach because, again, it focuses on the individual. What can we do to create an environment, that is tailored to
the person.
to the person, right? Exactly, and see what the reality is, and then try to do the better from there. Are you worried at all that are you worried at all about the issue of where to draw a line? Like, in particular, I mean, people say, well, I mean, like I said, I mean, it's okay to say where do we draw the line on the negative side of things, but then we also have to worry about the positive side of things. Like, if we have to worry about where to draw the line on things that we should censor, we have to ask ourselves, what is the best thing that we can actually allow, right? I mean, there's you see what I'm saying here, right?
I see what you're saying.
There's both sides.
Yeah, so it's like a spectrum, right, of behavior, and like where is the line. I would say, like,
there's two lines. There's two lines is what I'm saying.
Yeah, there's two lines. So
right, yeah.
In this specific situation, and again, I am a big fan of trying to look at the situations specifically and individually. In this specific situation, I would just trust the guest as it related to the line, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would, like, you know where the line is, so I'm going to trust you on what your line is for things that ought to be censored. And then for something that, like, the best thing that doesn't need to be censored, that line, I just think, like, personal attacks just appear to be off limits. Mm-hmm. Anything that's like a fair question, based on the facts of the story, like, yeah, that should be something that you should talk about. You have to ask tough questions. You have to ask hard questions. You have to sometimes ask questions that make you feel uncomfortable because you don't know where they're going to lead, or you don't know if it is off limits. But I mean, I think that the host of, or the facilitator of these types of conversations should be paying a very close attention to the level of comfortability of the guest, should be paying attention to, like, where they clam up, or where they're okay moving forward. I think there's a lot of nuance here as it relates to each individual person.
Let me be specific. What if your guest is irritated, let's say hypothetically, and I'm not saying that's the same situation, but I'm just curious where to draw the line. What if your guest is irritated with the type of language that is being used in the chat for people to address each other, not necessarily the guest, it's the guest himself or herself? Like, people say, I don't like how, people in the chat address each other. I find that offensive. What would you do in that situation?
I would just not have the interview live and not introduce chat at all. Because at that point, things are becoming, like, so subjective that you don't really know exactly what's going to be offensive or what isn't. Like, there is a line here where, like, we can't expect everybody to have our worldview. We can't expect everybody to believe everything that we do in the exact same order that we believe everything subjectively based on our life experience, right? So, like, I do think there is a line. However, as it relates to crossing the line, I think it's fairly obvious, at least to me, when lines are crossed and people are attacked personally and people are just being nasty just to be nasty, just to like tear
Law of
somebody
large
down.
numbers, law of large numbers. That's going to happen. There's always going to be the 5% of the worst drivers, the 5% of the worst people on the internet, the 5% of the worst on anything. Like there's always going to happen.
And I mean, for what it's worth, you know, like anybody that wants to shit on me, go for it.
Right.
And Duncan too, actually.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
He's a fan of getting shit on, apparently.
Yeah, no, I mean, as like I said, I mean, I cannot be offended. Like people have tried before, like you know, I can.
Oh, I can be offended. I've been through it. I've been offended, but now I've gone through the experience so much that now I'm just like, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think I told you the story, right? My school when I was a kid, you know, after that one incident, I never got offended again in my life. You know, my uncle has just passed away, and I went like through a horrific, like, you know, traumatic experience as a teenager. And then I go to school and everybody's making fun of me. Oh, look at him. He lost his uncle. Ha, 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 ha. He's crying. What a baby. You know, it's like, I realized after that point, you know, it's like, and you know, you can only be hurt if you let other people hurt you. Like words cannot, like, it's up to you. Offense can only be taken, not given, right? I mean, you decide whether you want to be offended or not. So I decided I'm never going to be offended again in my life. But
sure.
But regardless, though, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So like I know what you're saying, right? I understand it fundamentally. I also think that like there are some people whose uncle passes away every 2 weeks,
right?
Where they deal with this nonstop and it's never ending. Right. In which case, like at some point, you know, enough is enough. Like,
do you think that's better or worse, by the way, like having a constant exposure? Does that make you like grow thicker skin, or does it make your skin worse? That's an interesting question, I guess.
I think it depends on the person. You know, I think there are these you know, Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, right? There are these events. You know, Viktor Frankl went, he was in a concentration camp in Nazi Germany, and wrote a book about his experience. Really just incredible book. But what I found was that there's effectively two types of people who go through, like, that is like maybe the most extreme type of situation that a bunch of people can go through. However, like Viktor Frankl found like another level of perseverance that is just almost like inhuman level of perseverance, right? So like when he was put in this exceptionally dangerous, high pressure, brutal situation, he transcended his past self and grew into something much bigger, much more impactful. Whereas other people who are exposed to the same thing totally fall apart, which I think the majority of humans, right, fall into, where you can only take so much, and what they were, you know, what the Jewish population in Nazi Germany were exposed to is just atrocious and terrible. And I mean, it was designed to break wills, right? It was designed to break people. So I think that it depends, you know, on the person, where sometimes that sort of exposure can make somebody transcend, and then sometimes it doesn't. And so it just depends on the human being. But far be it from me, for somebody that went through that experience and made it out alive and dealt with a lifetime of PTSD, and they, you know, are obviously going to be upset when it's talked about, right? Or people direct things at them. Like, I think that's a type of person that you protect, that you go out of your way to not put them through that. Or there are other people that can talk about it openly and don't seem to be affected as much, right? So to me, it's just personal. It's like, what kind of human are you, and how much has this affected you? And if you're able to talk about it openly, or if you're able to just like brush everything off that's said, then great. But if you're not, then we still have to honor and protect that too.
Right. As you know, I'm not a very big fan of like the idea of protection in
Yeah,
general. Like, yeah, because of
unless it comes to poker, right? You know what
so I knew you would troll me about this eventually. We'll get back to that, but
Sure, I know you think that protection is I mean, to put it bluntly, arrogant.
Yeah, it's exactly. So there's two issues. One is you said it perfectly. One is arrogance, right? You know,
Sure.
we think we can actually help somebody else when in actuality we cannot even help ourselves, because none of us has figured out how to live our lives, right? I mean,
Sure.
this is an ongoing process. It's very difficult. It's very I would feel that actually meta arrogant to try to protect other people, not just arrogant, super arrogant. But then there's another thing which I'm worried about, and that's fragility. Like, no, I mean, I know it comes from a good place, right? I mean, I'm just saying,
I know what you're saying. Yeah,
I'm not trying to, talk. But these are things that I'm
this
constantly
motherfucker just called me arrogant and meta arrogant in the same breath. Look at this guy.
The worst. No, because I'm not sure we're talking about the same type of protection, right? What you're saying here, and there's a huge difference. You're talking about people who know exactly what their vulnerabilities are, and they're actively seeking for help. That's a different type of protection, right? This is sort of like a warranted protection, like somebody who goes, for example, to psychiatrist and says, listen, I mean, I have an issue with an addiction, I need help. That's a different type of help and protection, right? This is sort of like a self-realized situation where you realize your weaknesses and then you try to see how to work around them. For me, when I'm thinking of protection in general, especially when it comes to public policy, is unwarranted protection. Like the government says, you know what, I'm going to protect you because gambling is bad, right? So we're going to restrict all gambling. You can only go to Vegas, to gamble, and if you're lucky, and you have card rooms, in California and wherever you are, you can play there. So this is the type of protection that concerns me. The type where I'll tell you what's good for you. I'll tell you what you need. This is what you need.
Sure. There's levels to this, right?
Of course,
like there's many levels, and that was why I started on YouTube chat room, because to me, Greatness Village on Slack, I'm sorry, it's not a democracy.
That's fine. Yes.
It is an authoritarian regime where I am the dictator, and you type bad beat stories and you get dictated.
I love this.
So
and this is okay, by the way, right? Because you're very clear about this, right? I mean, it's everybody knows what they're expecting.
Yeah, I'm the mayor. I run the show in Greatness Village, and guess what? It is not a right that you are allowed into my my Slack channel.
Very good.
So it's not a right that you're allowed into my YouTube chat. These things are not like God-given, and so as it relates to like these specific parameters, yeah, be a dictator. I would be a dictator on my YouTube channel and just ban everybody that is trying to like tear my guests down, because for a bunch of reasons. I think that like the downside to banning people or moderating them too heavily, it's like, oh, they might not watch my YouTube videos anymore. They may not interact with my channel. But in my experience, those are not like great customers anyway. They're not going to buy anything. They're going to be the first to complain if you try to sell them something for 99 cents, because apparently, content creators just exist on magic pixie dust that pays all their bills, right? So like they're just, to me, the trolls, they're just not offering anything of value to anybody, and so like just axe them. But that's my personal preference and my opinion, and there are lots of people that run their own little villages differently, and guess what, good for you.
Right. And speaking of that, because I guess the one question is, what are some good heuristics, right? I mean, you said, for example, the trolls, that's ask them, what are some other good heuristics? Because
maybe you enjoy the trolls. I don't know. Like this is my subjective reality, right?
For sure. And this is our subjective reality, right? I mean, we have our subjective podcast, but part of the reason why I'm asking this question is because I noticed, and that's, my interpretation of the situation. I mean, obviously, Ebony was very upset, but at the same time, I also noticed that Joy was all very, very sad, if I were to use a word, right? I mean, he really felt in some way he failed his guest, or potentially he was pondering whether he failed as an interviewer, but at the same time he was like, again, everything happened so quickly, and he was like, where do I draw the line? Essentially, it seemed like he was asking those questions. What am I
Wrong
supposed to do?
time.
Wrong time to ask the questions. You already addressed that, right? He should have done
Yep.
it. He should have done it earlier. But it does create an interesting situation, because somebody could value, the freedom, or a certain freedom as they see it, and at the same time they value a certain quality out of their interviewees, right? So that's why I'm asking, like, what are some heuristics to navigate in situations like that?
I mean, you have to be a leader. Like that's
Okay.
You have to be responsible for your audience. You have to be responsible for your guest. And I mean, when that stuff happens, it falls on you, which is why you have to be a leader from the jump and have to have these conversations. You have to be able to stop.
Absolutely.
Right?
I think you're making a very good point, and sorry to interrupt you, but I want to illustrate that point. You're making a very good point, that if you think there is a conflict between the way you want to run things, because apparently, Joey wants to allow a certain freedom in his chat, and at the same time, running the risk of offending or otherwise making your guests uncomfortable, you got to be aware of that potential conflict and try to resolve it.
Yeah,
right? Ahead of time, perhaps.
Or, you're kind of wanting your cake and to eat it too, right? You don't want to censor it, but you also want to have a guest who just had a high profile cash on your show who is going to be upset by the chat, right? You don't get both, so like
I don't know about like, I mean, I don't know if he knew that already. I mean, he didn't seem like he was like, you think maybe, I mean, I don't know, but
I mean, I sure. Come on, you have over 100,000 YouTube subscribers and you're watching a female, you're doing a live interview with a female on the show. Like, you have to be aware that bad shit is gonna bubble to the surface.
I don't think there were like any of like, I think the conversation started to derail when they were basically talking about I think Daniel Negreanu came up and Phil Nagy, like, and they would start talking about women versus men. I think that's when the situation, like, before that, it was perfectly fine. I think the conversation derailed when it was basically about the male-female politics, I guess you can
again, I mean, the facilitator decides on the tangent and the path that everybody goes down, but I mean, to me, it's like something's happening, there's high emotion, let's take a breath, let's pause and figure out the best way to go forward that makes sense for everybody, right? I mean, that to me just should be the protocol. But again, this is how I run things.
Right.
So my protocols and the way that I think about stuff is just limited to specifically me. But as you're trying to provide a platform that is only good things. And now look, like you have this spectacle where we're talking about it and not in a good way. And people are writing articles about it, right? It's not like, oh, what the great conversation that Ebony and Joey had. It's all about this. And I mean, again, it goes like, responsibility falls on the Joey Ingram. That's there's no other way around it.
Yeah. So is there any responsibility on the guest at all?
Yeah, probably. So the responsibility of the guest is, I mean, to ask, I guess, to ask the person who's hosting the interview to make sure that your values are in alignment, that if X, Y, or Z happens, that there is some kind of future protocol, right? Like when I start a conversation with my podcast guests, it's not live. And so I always tell them, if we go, like, just feel free to say whatever you want to say. If we go into a territory that afterwards you're like, that was really uncomfortable and I would rather not release that, we'll just cut it from the conversation, right? So, and it's a lot tougher doing these things live because things happen and you can't really adjust like that after the fact. But I mean, yeah, I do think that the guests do have responsibility. But really, it's all about just communication between guest and host, and making sure that everything's good there. And if everything's good there, then you can deal with whatever the chat throws at you, right? You have an answer, you have a solution. But that's got to be where it starts.
I think that's another key word here, communication, right? I mean, I think some of the biggest issues, and we see that happening, by the way, right now in the chess world with the cheating scandal. The key word here is communication. When there's issues, when there's situations, the best way to deal with those things is talking them through. And also with the poker scandal, like when Bryn Kenny went to Joey recently, and there was an opportunity for Martin at some point to show up and have a conversation, both Joey and Bryn said that they didn't want to do it, and I remember thinking, the best way to resolve a situation like this is to have the accuser and the accusee face to face and have this uncomfortable conversation. Nobody wants to have that uncomfortable conversation, but communication sometimes is the best way to resolve those things. It's one of those things.
What do you think it means when the sides don't really want to openly communicate publicly? Like, to me, it's like, feels like the downside outweighs the upside for that conversation to go down.
Correct, but I mean, in a meta level, I would say that the upside, not for the individuals, but for the rest of the society, is nearly always positive, right?
Yeah.
So,
but
of course,
like in a case where like there's a cheating scandal going on, they don't give a shit about the positive of society at large, right? That's not even a factor.
Of course, I'm not saying I don't understand it. I'm just saying that you made a very excellent point about communication, and I'm just saying that the communication can solve even seemingly like impossible issues.
Sure.
And I'm talking about for the entire system, not necessarily for the individuals. The individuals can have, and similarly in a situation like this, I would agree with you 100%. It is very important to take control of the situation, no matter what happens.
Yeah, I mean, and some things are outside of the person facilitating the conversation's control. Some things, like somebody replies to a tweet, you can't. They're going to, like, somebody's going to leave a comment on Apple Podcasts or whatever it is. Like these things you just can't do anything about because they're outside of your realm of control. But the things that you do have some type of control over, I think you should just manage them. It just feels like good manners to me.
Absolutely, and I would agree with that. I guess there's two questions. One question is, what do you think about? I guess that question goes into politics. I'm not going to ask it. I'm not that. Never mind. But there's another question. No, I mean,
when you hear a question start and then it's not asked,
I'll ask it. It's like
now I just need to see that question. I just want to know.
Makes sense. Okay, so the question is basically this: there was a claim at some point that behaviors of, which is essentially what made me try to think myself, what would be as a society a good place to draw that line, and why I wrote the article. But there was a concern at some point that Joy's behavior or lack thereof is contributing to a much bigger problem. That's the best way of putting it. So what do you think about that? Like, do you
what
think
is the bigger problem?
The bigger problem potentially means that like women are going to feel more uncomfortable in the poker world. Like, essentially, lack of censorship can actually potentially propagate a bigger problem.
I don't know the answer to that, because I don't know anybody that's like, I don't know the journey to entering the poker world if it goes through watching Joey Ingram podcasts on YouTube.
And it's not about Joey. I mean, I'm just asking, just what your thoughts are.
I mean, the truth is that we, as players, although it doesn't happen as often as it does before, have just felt like we could do whatever we wanted to do at like a live cash game table or even a tournament. We can just talk shit to people in front of their face. We can treat them terribly, and there's almost zero downside. I think that as a collective, we just need to do a better job of policing, just treating people like human beings and making poker just a relative safer space. And like over time, I think it's gotten better. I had Jan Fisher on the podcast like a year or two ago, and she dealt in like the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and said that it was atrociously bad back then. Absolutely. And that, I asked her specifically for like people that didn't treat dealers like garbage. And there were few names that came to her mouth, and there were, she dealt to most everybody.
Right.
So that's a big problem, right? And I think that problem has gotten minimized over time. But yeah, I mean, it's just, to me, I just think that there should be some kind of code of conduct as it relates to behavior. You can't just throw your chips. You can't get pass out drunk and start talking shit to people just because you feel like it, or just, yeah, I think dealers and poker room managers need to be empowered to do a better job of making everything, making these things kind of out of bounds. And then outside of like that, I think that's just the first thing. But then like on YouTube, you can't manage it. Yeah, right. Like if that's the platform of choice, then you can't manage what your chat's going to say, or you can't manage everything they're going to say. So in that sense, it's more of like a wild west. And I mean, a better way to go about it would be to, you could have a Zoom meeting or a private feed where people have to like sign up and give their actual first and last name to make an account, so that whenever they make a comment, there's a person that you can see, right? It follows them. I think the anonymity is probably the biggest culprit here. I don't think like people are not as so brave as to walk up, most people anyway, to somebody's face and like say the things they say in a YouTube chat room. So I mean,
you mentioned something earlier which I thought was very important. You said that YouTube chat is not society, and what I would say personally, society is not society, because people were not going to go out to people and say what they have in their minds. But sometimes what you get on YouTube chat, you get people their true feelings. They get out, or you see, as they say, you get to see who the person is by when they're losing at the poker table. Then you get to see their real self. They've been polite all along, and then all of a sudden they start throwing cards at the dealer and doing things like that. But yeah, but that's a good point though. Like screening essentially.
Yeah, screening, reducing anonymity, and yeah, like at the end of the day, I do think that. I do think that there's going to be bad stuff. I think it's unavoidable. And so in that way, like guests do need to take responsibility for their reaction to these things that are beyond the control mechanism that, say, the host has, or their ability to control the things that are going on. Absolutely. And I mean, yeah, I wish people could be better. Right. in an anonymous chat situation, but that just isn't going to be how the world works.
No, it's a good point. Like I wish people they could be better, because it sort of like raises the question, is policing all we can do, or is there like an alternative way, like for example improving the culture somehow? Like are there specific ways where the people who are listening right now in the podcast can conduct themselves at the poker table? Or because again, you mentioned the word policing, and I wanted to come back to this.
Yeah, like I could say that it's just like in some spaces things are acceptable and tolerated, and in others they aren't. I think there's been one misogynistic comment in Greatness Village over the last 3 years, and I moderated it immediately and sent them a message immediately, right? And like in some spaces, that's not going to be moderated and it's going to thrive. And in other spaces, it will. So to me, again, it's all about your vibe attracts your tribe. You have to be a leader of this audience, and you have to let them know what is acceptable to you and what is unacceptable, because you're the tyrant. You're the one making the laws and the rules of the kingdom. So in that way, I think that's really where it all starts. And yeah, some shitheads will slip through.
Sure. No. I mean, you're very clear. I think your point is very clear. I mean, you're essentially saying this is not a public domain. It's a domain that has specific rules. And, if you're a good leader, you can create a situation where with good rules. Now, how about when we go public though? Right? Because again, I mean, if you're saying in your house, you tell your guests how to behave, both perhaps directly or indirectly, by the way you're sending a certain message, by the way you behave yourself. But what if the situation, like, what if we have like a public domain or a semi-public domain?
I mean, if you go on Howard Stern, right, and you're like a female model, you're probably going to expect, chauvinistic behavior from the host and from the collective of people, right? If you go on Oprah, it's probably going to be quite a different experience. So basically, like, as it relates to public entities, to me, it's about what the facilitator sets up and the rules that are in place in this environment. That is the expectation. That to me is like what it all boils down to. It is like some things that are acceptable in one place are not acceptable in another.
Sure.
Well, why is that true? Well, it's because of the rules that have been set up by the leaders in charge of each space. I'm probably not going to go on, again, I'll use Oprah and get into a fist fight with another guest. But if I go on Jerry Springer, then it's quite likely that I'm going to get in a fist fight with another guest, and it's tolerated and acceptable and even encouraged, right? So yeah, to me, it boils down to whatever the people in charge create and facilitate.
But how about leaderless or like relatively leaderless environments? Like, for example, let's say poker room.
Mad Max.
No, not that
apocalyptic.
Not
every man for themselves at that point.
But let's say, like you play a game in Vegas, and of course, like every poker room has their own rules, but there are ways to conduct oneself, right? And unless somebody's breaking specific rules of the casino, they're not going to necessarily be interrupted. Sometimes people are very loud, and the casino, the floor may not say something for that. There's specific situations which
I hate it. I hate these situations because, again, I'm not starting from a framework of knowledge of what this person is okay dealing with, and I hate putting myself in a position where, like, I don't know how people are affected by a specific behavior, right? Like, you can talk shit to me at the table,
sure,
nobody needs to stand up and like protect me, because it's not going to have any effect, right?
That's part of the arrogance we were talking earlier. Yeah, absolutely. I understand what you're saying. Yeah,
sure. Well, I mean, I'd like to address that too, the arrogance side of this, because I mean, I think like there are situations, right, where your kid is playing a sport and a spectator who's sitting right next to you just says that they're trash, right? And then your kid's like, oh, how'd you do? And you're like, well, not so well. And as a matter of fact, the person next to me said that you're trash, right? You don't tell them that is not what you verbalize to them, because you know that they would be emotionally affected if they had that knowledge, right? And that's what I mean by like protecting someone. Just like, to me, people don't need to know everything, and a lot of the negative stuff severely impacts a human being. And so gating that.
If I may push a little bit on that, though. Yeah. So I agree with you that, like and it could actually, part of the reason why one should not tell their kids at that point, oh, you suck because that guy said it, so is because you're conveying a much worse message than the reality is. Because again, the message from that person is not the reality. It's probably one of the worst messages. However, I would argue that not telling your kid they did great when they actually didn't do great, but perhaps like choosing a language as, we can do better next time. Or
we can practice. We can work on the deficiencies.
Exactly.
We can grow. We can improve. Right. Yeah.
But that's what I'm talking about, right? I mean, there is quite a spectrum of approaches to tell the truth, right? That's the part that I would push back. Like telling a kid, and that's, I think, part of the psychologists have written papers about the issue that we have with modern kids, right? I mean, modern kids are much more fragile than kids of,
That's what they've always been saying. There was a Twitter article about this going back to like the 1800s in newspapers, talking about every
Yes.
generation is like softer than the next generation.
Which is
It's
true,
just
though.
interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting, right? I mean, it is.
Is it? I don't know whether it's true or not.
It is like we have less exposure. I mean, it's true by definition because technology has advanced, right? So we don't have to expose ourselves to the same dangers that we did in the past. That is not to say we should, like unwillingly willingly go and put ourselves in, sleep under under the stars for like a month or so, or walk barefoot or something like that. But it is a fact of life that we have less stressors than we once had. And then the question becomes, what are the kids are going to be facing at some point? So the concept of fragility is a real one, and I'm concerned about it, right? That's why I said it's both arrogance and potentially expose somebody to fragility. And
I think that making the assumption that this upcoming generation is more fragile, I don't know. I mean, I see a lot of fragility in the past generation, especially like the adults, as it relates to like anything that anybody talks about ever. They just appear to be exceptionally fragile and unwilling to talk about the big topics, or the things that actually like matter about humanity. I don't know. Well, I mean, I know we're getting off topic here about the fragility of the current generation of people, but I don't know whether that's like perception or reality, and really hard to quantify.
Either. Yeah, I don't know either. And I'm not honestly, like, I'm saying that I'm concerned mostly more than anything, right?
Yeah. So it's your personal subjective.
I'm concerned, not even opinion. I'm concerned about the fact that fragility could potentially be an issue. And it's a very complicated thing. And I'm not saying treating a kid one way or another is definitely going to create fragility or anything like that. I'm not making, but the fact that we are exposed, for example, to lesser stressors, that's actually a fact. That's not even an opinion. Whether or not that makes us fragile obviously varies greatly, but it is a concern of the psychologists, is what I'm saying, right? And some of it may have to do with the fact that we may be overprotective.
Yeah, I mean, we need better leadership. Like that's maybe that's always been the downside of humanity. We just always need better leadership. But I mean, we just need, in general, better leadership. We
cannot have enough of, for sure.
Life is about struggles and failure and success and being resilient, and falling to pieces. And it's cyclical. And I mean, we need to know when we need to do better, right? Like we need to hear outside leadership tell us you're not doing good enough. You need to do this, right? And I think oftentimes we don't have that, or we're not even open to such feedback. But yeah, anyway, that to me is like, if you want to improve, I think there's multiple ways of skinning the cat, as they say. And we need criticism.
Absolutely.
We need to be faced with hard truths, but we don't need to be buried under truths or half truths that are hurtful and just put us in a downward spiral that we can't get out of.
Absolutely. No, and one also thing that one should add, I guess, like a little bit of a different perspective before I ask you my last question, is that I think certain people need leadership more than others. I would say that's also something to take into account, right? I mean, there is the classic example would be people who are promoting like self-help, like people like Tony Robbins, or like more modernly Jordan Peterson. There are some people who would say their lives have been changed because, again, maybe their lives were somewhat chaotic, and then by listening to people who have their lives a little bit more in order, they can be helped. But for some other people who perhaps they're already in some sense self-regulating or overachievers, or they're leaders themselves, people like that, suggestions like that may even sound totalitarian or like very difficult to, who are you to tell me how to live my life, right? I mean, there is that approach too, and some people are more sensitive to that thing. I know I'm one of those people. Like, I'm very, very skeptical of people giving advice, especially when it comes to universal advice.
Yeah.
That being said, leadership can take a lot of forms, and it's not just do that is one extreme.
Well, it's not a cult, right? You're not like believing. You're not like taking every single belief system from this specific leader. You're learning in their specific domain of expertise that you're inquiring about.
Exactly, and it's a voluntary entrance, right? I mean, if you
voluntary for sure. I mean, it's hard to make impact when it's involuntary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I just wanted to make that distinction, because again, leadership is a double-edged sword. Like it can be helpful when people need it, but it can also restrict somebody from expressing themselves and flourish and think differently.
And create creativity and also progression of humanity, right? If we all had to listen to the foremost authority on a given thing and weren't able to think for ourselves and come at problems from different angles, humanity would struggle to progress in the way that it has. So I think there's definitely benefit of the pioneers. I do think pioneering is quite a difficult endeavor, though.
Yes. Very, very difficult indeed. Which brings me to my last question. Speaking of pioneering, how much pioneering do you think we're doing? Like, are we heading in the right direction, would you say? Like, how much, like, in terms of like our collective efforts as human beings, and as poker society, do you think we're heading in any direction, first of all, like you said, but do you think we're heading in the right direction?
Probably not. I don't know the direction. I don't. It's like I'm too zoomed in on this time and moment to really have a good idea. I think that maybe there are ways to like quantify it objectively, good to bad comment ratios on YouTube. I don't know exactly how to go about collecting data, but maybe there are ways to like find an answer to that. But with the knowledge that I have personally, I have no idea what direction we're going. I don't know. And I think we're getting like pulled in many different directions too. I think that there are some significant like downsides to like full privacy, for instance, which a lot of people are after these days. They want everything to be private, everything to be encrypted and under the radar. I don't know. It's a strange world, Duncan.
Absolutely.
Plus it's probably just subjective from person to person too, 100%. Right? And their own experience. So I don't really see how it's an answerable question. So I'm just going to say we're out on a raft going where the ocean takes us.
I guess I could ask you, from your readings of history, would you rather live on any other historical time than this one? Subjectively.
No chance. You kidding me?
Okay.
We got the full power of humanity in my pocket. That just, when I was little, I read encyclopedias that were like printed in the 1960s.
Right.
So the information was probably not up to date. Now I want to know anything, I can look at Wikipedia. I mean, we live in my opinion, the best time to be alive.
That's an answer. So that's, at least your vote, the subjective vote, is that we're progressing, because you would be,
in general, yes. It was more related to like our specific like censorship topic, but as humanity, I believe we are progressing. Now, I mean, what's the downside of progression? That we, cause catastrophe upon ourselves and in the entire human race. I would say that's probably pretty likely outcome of our progression, which is a fairly significant downside. But yeah, we are progressing for better and worse.
Beautiful. So there you have it, folks. We're progressing, so we can live it on,
there we go. Yep.
On a positive note.
If you weren't convinced, the fact that you're listening to this on a pair of AirPods, doing God knows what, just jogging down the road or whatever it is, like driving in your car, following your GPS that gives you guided instructions. Now you know it. We are progressing humanity. Yep.
Excellent. We don't know if we're going to make the next 100 years, but we're progressing until then. So
yeah, we'll progress until we progress right off the cliff, and I guess that'll be it.
That would be it. Exactly. So where can people find us?
Chasing Poker Greatness Podcast on all of the platforms: Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, all the ones. Why Alex Beats Bobby, Bobbie on YouTube, Ask the Math Doctor on Twitter and at CPG Podcast on Twitter. And you could also go to greatnessvillage.com or chasingpokergreatness.com. We have some like exciting things happening at chasingpokergreatness.com that I'm obligated to speak about because my SEO team has forced me at gunpoint. They're like, you need to tell people about the stuff. We've aggregated a bunch of customer reviews on specific online poker platforms. You can find that portal at chasingpokergreatness.com. Felt like a pretty big need in the space was to have actual user generated reviews of platforms instead of saying, Googling what's the best poker platform to play on. And then, it being a 30-way tie for first place. We actually have like actual customers who are playing on the platforms giving feedback on, the software, the perks, money in, money out, speed, just all of those, player pools, population, customer service, all of those factors that really matter. Felt that the best way to go about making a page like that was to just ask the people that play on the things. And if a platform's like garbage, well, then it'll get ones and there won't be a 50-way tie for first.
That's exactly right. And this is something, by the way, that I don't know if you knew that, but did you know who started this idea, which is a brilliant idea, by the way? The idea,
is it Bezos?
That's right. That's who he is. Exactly. That's Jeff Bezos. He started that with Amazon. So with all the hate that he's getting, he got something really right. And that's the idea of, advertising, tell the truth to the customers, right? I mean, communication, we're talking about this. Communication is the most important thing.
Yeah. It's like, I don't know if any of the listener is familiar with Animaniacs, but, good idea, user reviews, and good communication for everything. Penis-shaped spaceship, bad idea for Bezos. And I think that's the note that we'll end on. We'll end on penis-shaped bad ideas.
That's the title for today's podcast.
Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next week.